No army had ever carried war so far. They conquered an empire from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. They plundered the great city of Babylon and enslaved the tribes of Israel. Even the Pharaoh of Egypt paid them tribute. Their army became the largest yet seen, their warriors the greatest, and their warfare the cruelest. In September of 655 BC, an Assyrian army under King Ashurbanipal set off from its base in what is now southern Iraq. Its mission to repel an invasion by its Elamite neighbors. Having achieved this, it carried the war south into the enemy's territory. The decisive battle took place on the Ulai River before the city of Susa. At daybreak, the first Assyrians came into view. Like a storm gathering, thousands of horses and men assembled. The signal for attack sounded, and the chariots charged. In heavy fighting, the Elamites were pushed back against the river by Assyrian cavalry and infantry. Many thousands were drowned as they tried to cross the Ulai. By nightfall, the river was choked with corpses. In their hour of victory, the Assyrians showed no mercy.
I cut their throats like lambs. I cut off their precious lives as one cuts a string. Like the many waters of a storm, I made the contents of their gullets and entrails run down upon the wide earth. My prancing steeds plunged into the streams of blood and filth. With the bodies of their warriors, I filled the plain like grass.
Among the victims is the Elamite king Tuman and his son.
Tuman, king of Elam, fled to save his life and hid in a wood. The crossbar of his royal transport broke and it overturned on him. In desperation, he said to his son, "Use your bow."
His son fought bravely, but it was to no avail, and the king was caught and beheaded. The grisly trophy was taken to the Assyrian king, who slashed it and spat on it. Then he hung it on a tree for all to see, while he celebrated his victory with a banquet. Tuman's followers were no less harshly treated. Some were made to grind up the bones of their dead. Others were flayed alive. When the Assyrian king returned to his capital, Nineveh, he ordered his artisans to immortalize the triumphs of his victorious army. In room after room of his cavernous palace, they carved the gruesome details of his butchery. Men impaled on spikes, eyes put out, heads severed. To ambassadors from distant realms, the writing was on the wall. Take an Assyrian at your peril. The great Assyrian army arose from humble origins, a small state surrounding the holy city of Ashur, from which they drew their name. Well situated in the rain belt of what would become northern Iraq, Assyria benefited from the fertile banks of the river Tigris, a kingdom as prosperous as the land. But in the absence of any natural boundaries, these productive grain lands invited attack. The only salvation lay in the development of an effective military machine. For many years, Assyria was under the thrall of other kingdoms. The tide was turned in the early 10th and late 9th centuries BC, during the reigns of Adad-nirari II and his son Tukulti-Ninurta II.
Ashur, father of the gods, empowered me to depopulate and repopulate, to make broad the boundary of the land of Assyria.
Assyria began to enlarge its borders, but with each change of season, the empire withered. As soldiers returned to the fields, rebellion sprouted, and the conquered regions had to be reconquered. This all changed in 745 BC with the accession to the Assyrian throne of Tiglath-Pileser III, a renowned general. He vowed to make Assyria invincible by creating its first standing army. Encouraged by the prospects of a career in arms, thousands of young men enlisted. To support them in the field, Tiglath-Pileser created a number of military institutions, starting with an armory.
To provide proper arrangements for the camp, to look after the steeds, the mules, the chariots, the battle equipment, and the enemy booty.
Iron was the backbone of the army. Each soldier was issued a conical iron helmet, a sturdy breastplate of interlocking strips of bronze, and strong leather boots. The tallest men were armed with iron-tipped spears. When they closed with the enemy, they would use their daggers. The bow was the Assyrian army's main offensive weapon, and archers made up the bulk of the infantry. They were usually employed in pairs, with the second man carrying a tall shield made from thick plaited reeds, curved at the top to deflect arrows. At the New Year festival, the king inspected his army to ensure its readiness to fight. Fed, clothed, and armed at his expense, the Assyrian warriors became the most professional army the world had yet seen. Well equipped though they were, the Assyrians were always on the lookout for more material. Horses for chariots, iron for weapons, timber for siege machines. To acquire these tools of war, they were forced to campaign further and further afield.
Gold, silver, tin, copper, linen garments with many splendid trimmings, large and small monkeys, ivory, ebony. This their tribute I received, and they embraced my feet.
From his palace in Nineveh, the king was in constant communication with the far-flung provinces of his empire. Messengers relayed signals from fire towers or wrote dispatches on clay tablets. In 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib received the ominous news that King Hezekiah of Judah was refusing to pay tribute. He immediately mobilized his army, tens of thousands strong, swelling its ranks with levies from his subject states.
Get together your prefects and the horses of your cavalry immediately. Whoever is late will be impaled in the middle of his house.
Before the Assyrians set off, priests sacrificed bulls and goats, and the troops prayed to Ishtar, goddess of war.
O thou, heroine among the gods, like a bundle rip him open in the midst of battle. Raise up against him a tempest, an evil wind.
The Assyrians enjoyed an advantage possessed by few enemies: speed over the ground. The roads it traveled on were in excellent condition, maintained by the shovels of prisoners of war. Over such terrain, it could advance over 30 kilometers a day. At the head of the new army rode the king and his personal bodyguard. Then came his cavalry and chariots, and finally the infantry. Bringing up the rear was the long supply train with craftsmen making weapons as they rode. In surmounting natural obstacles, especially rivers, the Assyrians proved particularly ingenious. Vehicles were transported in large boats, with horses swimming behind. Soldiers crossed on inflated animal skins with their shields and weapons strapped to their backs. Forced to live off the land, such a huge army could not have gone far. The king solved this problem by setting up huge granaries throughout his empire. This enabled his troops to campaign nearly 500 kilometers from the nearest base of supply. Without this grain, they could not have fed the thousands of horses that were so vital to the Assyrian army. For its most feared weapon was the chariot. Since the reign of Adad-nirari II, the chariot had evolved from a two-man structure to a heavier four-man version, whose impact was as much psychological as physical. It was used in massed ranks as a shock weapon to shatter the enemy's line. Into this chaos would charge the supporting cavalry. Those who fled were cut down by horsemen. Those who remained were picked off by archers and spearmen. But the Assyrians were careful not to kill horses. So important were they to their military effort that the king appointed officials to oversee their capture. Most were rounded up in what is now northern Iran. As the supply of horses increased, the Assyrians developed a new weapon to complement the chariot: the mounted warrior. First seen in the 9th century BC, the riders operated in pairs, with one holding the reins of both horses so that the other could fire his bow. By King Sennacherib's reign, the horseman operated independently and was equipped with body armor, long lance, and bow. Against such a formidable foe, King Hezekiah of Judah dared not risk battle. He retreated within his capital, Jerusalem. His subjects did likewise, seeking refuge in walled cities throughout Judah. But one by one, these strongholds, some with walls of over 6 meters thick, were reduced. Meanwhile, Sennacherib dispatched a column to besiege Jerusalem. Anticipating such a move, Hezekiah had constructed an underground channel to provide the city with water. But the Assyrians were not above using threats to avoid a long siege and the consequent loss of men. Before the siege of Jerusalem began, an attempt was made to secure surrender. Rabshakeh, the chief cupbearer to the king, spoke to the defenders on the battlements in their native Hebrew. As he delivered his ultimatum, the promise of doom was being fulfilled, 50 kilometers to the south, at the town of Lachish. Built astride the trade route to Egypt, Lachish was as prosperous as it seemed secure. Behind its steep slopes and high walls, its defenders were confident of holding out. Just as confident, the Assyrians set up their camp behind an oval wall with defensive towers and set about building siege engines. The high wooden walls would protect the soldiers inside as they maneuvered the iron-tipped battering ram into place. This would then be used to pound the weakest point in a city's walls. In Lachish's case, its weak point was its gates. To approach them, the Assyrians first had to create ramps by using earth topped with timber. Over these, the siege engines were slowly wheeled. The king marshaled his forces. Stone slingers at the rear, then the archers protected by their tall shields. At the front, the spear carriers who would storm the walls. Together, they advanced, safe behind their huge siege engines. The engines themselves were protected from burning arrows and other missiles by a patchwork of leather sheets. If the leather did catch fire, a soldier was standing by with a huge ladle of water. Below, sappers, using iron and bronze tools, began to undermine the walls. Above, other soldiers mounted ladders to scale them. Archers and slingers kept down the heads of the defenders. No army had so perfected the art of siege. Such a multifaceted attack could not be withstood. When at last the walls were breached, the Assyrians rushed in, shielded by Ishtar, goddess of war.
Thy face shall not turn green, thy feet shall not tire, thy strength shall not fail thee in the heat of battle.
Ishtar was proved right, but the carnage was terrible. The ringleaders of the rebellion were impaled on stakes outside the city, their limp bodies an awful warning to those still holding out in Jerusalem. King Sennacherib rewarded his soldiers with a share of the booty, which included quivers, daggers, bows, furniture, and goblets. But not all tasted the fruits of victory. 1,500 Assyrians remained at Lachish in a mass grave. Meanwhile, King Sennacherib made good his losses and counted his spoils.
200,000 people, great and small, male and female. Horses, mules, camels, asses, cattle and sheep, without number.
In Judah, as was their custom, the Assyrians made sure the spirit of the conquered was broken by the forced migration of thousands, many as slaves. The Bible records that in 721 BC, 30,000 Sumerians were uprooted from their homes, the lost tribes of Israel.
As for Hezekiah, the Jew who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong cities, as well as the small cities in their neighborhood, which were without number, by leveling with battering rams and by bringing up siege engines, I did take.
Over the next 50 years, the Assyrian Empire was pushed to its furthest limits. In 675 BC, its warriors marched over 1,000 kilometers to conquer Egypt. Assyria had reached the zenith of its power. In its cities, peopled by merchants, craftsmen, artists, and scholars, civilization flourished as it never had before. But the Assyrians were overstretched. Their empire now spanned most of the Middle East. Instead of governing its subjects, it terrorized them. The conquered nursed their grudges and bided their time. In 612 BC, Assyria was attacked by the combined forces of the Medes and the Babylonians. The capital of Nineveh was mercilessly sacked. Its empire collapsed, its 1,000-year-old society vanished. But there were few who mourned the passing of so ruthless an empire. Many were only too glad to join in the exhortation of a man who had suffered under the Assyrian yoke, the Hebrew prophet, now.
All who hear the news of your destruction clap their hands for joy. Did no one escape your endless cruelty?